The short story, I Sexually Identify as an Attack Helicopter by Isabel Fall, met a lot of controversy in the months after it was published. I thought it was really engaging, and I think it sparked a lot of good conversations about gender and some really challenging topics that represents. I also just think it had really kick-ass writing. Some of it can be a little awkward and chunky, but it's never boring. Fall has a lot of fun with wordplay. She uses that term, the clitoral bulge of the cockpit, which is just nailed it. The first-person narrator is very confident and very intelligent. They have these moments where they'll make these strong statements and then tell the reader that they can just prove it later, and they do. This keeps you really engaged with the text, not so much to figure out what's going to happen, but to figure out how Barb is going to back up these weird statements that they keep making. It's like a Sherlock Holmes story, but for philosophy. And it's for this reason that I was really disappointed when I saw that Isabel Fall was being harassed because of claims of transphobia and enviphobia and even Nazism. People were suspecting that she was actually a cis man, and some people were saying that the relationship depicted is actually heteronormative and therefore not a depiction of non-binary people, which, let's just say, hurt my feelings. To be honest, it's hard not to see this criticism as the product of very shallow and uninformed reading. I get that people were hurt by this, and no one's feelings can be said to be wrong. I'm a very feelsy person myself, but I do try not to let my feels get in the way of criticism of other people's work. I like to notice them and figure out why they're there, and not necessarily impugn the author for making me feel that way. So what exactly is so hurtful about this story? Well, it explores a few theories of gender that are controversial and doesn't necessarily condone or condemn them, though they are pretty distinguishable. My analysis of the story is derived from Judith Butler's performativity and also modern radical trans theory, which is a weird subject. My understanding of modern radical trans theory is that it speaks to the tension and reconciliation between coercion and desire that we see in gender. Fall deconstructs the notion of gender as being either coercive or consensual, and sort of comes to the understanding that both can be true. While gender can be coercive and even destructive, it can still be engaged in with enthusiasm and joy. In Gender Trouble, Judith Butler spends a lot of time explaining how gender is shaped by the law. The law is basically an embodiment of all of the behaviors we are supposed to adopt based on what the powerful tells us to do. Not that the powerful is really such a clear-cut idea. No one is the powerful. It's sort of a rhizomatic system that everyone is sort of subjected to and contributes to. Whatever, you get the idea. Barb is both a transgression from and a strict embodiment of the law. All gender is produced by the law. Certain norms come about through language, trying to describe the world as it is, and this language is then prescribed coercively, as a projection of what should be according to the laws and language, rather than a description of what is. Anything outside this paradigm is not just maligned, it's unintelligible. You can no more identify with it than you can name yourself using sounds that you are unable to produce. The validity of your gender is directly equivalent to your right to be the gender that you say you are. That's what it means to be valid. The law, you see, is what allows for rights to exist in the first place. In my country, we have a constitution that we have all apparently agreed upon and ratified, a word I still don't know the meaning of, that guarantees a right to free speech. Another way of saying this, of course, is that the states and the enforcement bodies therein pinky promise not to use the force that they totally have to keep you from expressing yourself in the way that you see fit. If there is no greater transcendental substance to gender, and I'm sort of betting that there isn't, and gender is more cluster properties that we've constructed importance around, and I'm inclined to think that it is, then I think it's reasonable to say that others really do have the ability to determine our gender for us based on what is most efficient. This is to say that Seo-ji-hee, Barb's dead name, really was a woman before becoming anything else. And yet, their assigned gender at birth clearly didn't fit. They write of themselves, "When I was a woman, I wanted to machine myself." And maybe you can see where I'm going with this. There is a troubling implication here for the modern trans community. It isn't Barb's internal sense of identity that makes them not a woman, or even their desire not to be a woman. It's a power structure assigning them something new. What exactly is the difference between feeling uncomfortable with the gender you were assigned at birth and being that other gender? Perhaps according to Butler, this has to do with the fact that no one recognized he as another gender. They misinterpreted their discomfort with being a woman as somehow an expression of their sexuality, and who exactly can blame them for this? How can one take on the perceived qualities of a non-human in a social space? We need to have some kind of intelligible notion of what it means to be a human helicopter before we recognize people as being that. That intelligibility is bestowed by power, the law, to be useful. In this case, the literal government, a material embodiment of the law, is using their knowledge of the evolution of gender to make Barb a more effective killing machine for their own ends. So if gender is discursively constituted, a phrase I'm very proud of knowing, and I'm going to bring it up several times for that purpose. Discursively constituted, what's with the need for neurosurgery? Is the surgery a means of simulating the way gender would normally happen over a shorter timescale? Is the idea of being a helicopter gender so alien to human beings that it's impossible to conceive of the fact that Barb and Axis may simply have been born that way, like other trans people? Or cis people, for that matter? Enter Xenogender. I've always been a bit uneasy about attacking the helicopter meme. Transphobes will subscribe to the implication of the meme, and trans folks and allies will renounce it. But no one seems to allow for the possibility that a gender that feels like an attack helicopter may actually be, valid. By the way, xenogender is not the same thing as being Therian or otherkin. Otherkin or Therians identify with animals or mythical creatures in a way that doesn't speak to their gender, but more to their self-identified status as human. Some xenogender folks are otherkin, though not all of them are, and some otherkin do identify as a xenogender called machine gender, which is when your experience of your gender is closely aligned to your status as robotkin being a kind of otherkin. So the answer to the question of whether Barb could have changed genders without surgery is sort of ephemeral. The surgery changes something about Barb that has nothing to do with their internal sense of gender, because their gender was never limited to their internal sense of gender to begin with. Well, it seems to me that the surgery is doing a lot more than just changing their gender. Let me explain. Gender has to do with one's social role as designated to them, usually because of their sexual characteristics. But Barb doesn't need to understand the intention and values of a helicopter, they need to understand the physical body of the helicopter. The reactions need to be as fast and intuitive as if you saw a person bleeding out on the street. You wouldn't need a doctor to tell you that the bleeding needs to be stopped, would you? Because you have blood, and you know how important it is to keep that blood in your body. You know this intuitively. Maybe you can remember a time when you donated blood and felt a bit weak after, or you associate bleeding with pain. So when we refer to the physical body of someone with reference to their sexual characteristics, we use the term sex. That's what makes sex different from gender. And though it's called tactical role reassignment surgery, it acts a lot more like a sex reassignment. I know that we tend to call genital surgeries that affirm the identities of trans people sex reassignment, but that's not actually an accurate term. According to Butler, gender is just the apparatus by which sex is assigned. Without genders, there would just be bodies. Some have broad shoulders or wide hips, different chromosomes, penises, vaginas, whatever. Sure, there would be pretty noticeable differences, and one of those differences are pretty fundamental to keeping human beings around, but these differences would have no social significance if we didn't put so much importance on sexual dimorphism. But say you're a ruler. You want your people to reproduce, not just because that's what they like doing, but because throughout history, reproduction is power and wealth. It becomes necessary to facilitate categories of distinction to define these two types of breeders. By making gender a thing, suddenly clusters of anatomical characteristics, like height and genitalia, are assigned the significance of different sexes. That's not to say that there wouldn't be physical differences between the sexes without gender, just that the category of sex would not be necessary to discuss these differences. Now, as there are plenty of people who don't feel comfortable with the physical properties that designated them the sex they were assigned at birth, there is more explaining to do. Remember, according to Butler, language has an inaccurate way of describing and then prescribing categories like sex. If you're the kind of person whose gender can be best described as something other than the one you were assigned at birth based on your sexual characteristics, it is then very possible that you will develop an imagined body. According to Jacques Lacan, we all have an imagined body, which is an internal sense of what a body should look like that is produced first and foremost by language. It's discursively constituted. And if you're the kind of person whose gender doesn't match the one that you were assigned at birth, it's very possible that your imagined body will resemble the gender that society tells you you ought to have, based on your gender. So a transgender person will have a gender that is not in alignment with the one that they were assigned at birth. A transsexual person, who is likely transgender as well, will have an imagined body that is different than the one that they had at birth, or developed into. I feel that Barb is portrayed not just as transgender, but specifically transsexual. Their body is the Apache mystic, and they relieve dysphoria by being inside it. As Barb says about themselves, my body is a component of my mission, subordinate to who I truly am. If I say I'm an attack helicopter, then my body, my sex, is too. I'll prove it to you. The proof they provide is a physical sense of what it feels like to be in their body. Their imagined body becomes a literalized fantasy, which is something that performativity recognizes. Being inside the Apache mystic makes them feel whole. They can even share the body with another person. I like the fact that Fall recognizes this categorical distinction, yet still pushes the idea as far as she can. Barb didn't need to be transsexual in order to be authentically transgender, but demonstrating the link between the two was pretty enlightening. And the idea of Barb wanting to be a new gender is what I think is so radical about what Fall has done here. It reconciles the oppressive and coercive nature of gender while refusing to be made to feel compliant and subjugated. Gender might originate in the subconscious and be constituted by gesture and behavior, which is basically performativity in a nutshell. But that doesn't explain why we choose to perform the gender that we feel that we are. I'm not saying that Butler's theory is lacking, I'm saying that we don't tend to talk about the reasons why we choose to opt into our gender. And, since I'm agender and therefore have no authority on the matter, I'm going to borrow a take from Andrea Long Chu. She states that she does her gender because she wants to do her gender. She wants the trappings of womanhood. Something I could never understand. It must be underscored how unpopular it is on the left today to countenance the notion that transition expresses not the truth of an identity, but the force of a desire. This would require understanding transness as a matter not of who one is, but of what one wants. I doubt that any of us transition simply because we want to be women in some abstract academic way. I certainly didn't. I transitioned for gossip and compliments, lipstick and mascara, for crying at movies, for being someone's girlfriend. But now you begin to see the problem with desire. We rarely want the things we should. Any TERF will tell you that these items are just the traditional trappings of patriarchal femininity. And she won't be wrong either. Let's be clear. TERFs are gender abolitionists, even if their abolitionism is a shell corporation for garden variety moral disgust. TERF, for your edification, is a slightly less human iteration of a feminist. They believe in rights for women, but only if those women have the correct genitalia. Basically, they think trans women are either predatory men or men appropriating the shackles of womanhood. Her book Females is about how radically her life was affected by Valerie Solanas, both the author of the Scum Manifesto and the person who shot and seriously maimed Andy Warhol. In it, Chu puts forward a generalized, universal theory of what she refers to as femaleness. This isn't really so much about femaleness as a theory of gender, so much as it is femaleness as this universal, non-corporeal principle. She defines it as any psychic operation in which the self is sacrificed to make room for the desires of others. To be clear, she states that all people are actually females, especially if they're not women. This riffs on an idea that Solanas talks about in the Scum Manifesto, that women are actually the real, virile, bombastic, clear of thought and purpose gender, and men, in their physical dominance, have managed to trick women into thinking that they are the submissive, docile, compliant, and decorative ones, rather than the men themselves being this way. It isn't women who get penis envy, it's men who get pussy envy. Now, the TERF capacity for critical thought is severely encumbered by brainworms, but you can kind of see where this interpretation might have made them a little upset. Chu reiterates through the book the joy that she has in her femaleness, the paradox of desiring to be desired by others. If Isabel Fall ever sees this video, I want her to know that not everyone viewed her work as toxic, or harmful, or in need of canceling. It must have been really hard for her to spend that much time and energy and effort on something that ended up being so maligned and misunderstood. I mean, I'm a writer myself, and I know how much exacting detail that I put into my work. I think it's amazing that she was able to create such a rich conversation through genuinely beautiful writing. I hope this story sticks around in our consciousness long enough for it to be rediscovered and reevaluated, maybe in a time when we're more ready to hear it. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. I'm so glad that I don't have to read anymore and that I can just speak off the cuff. I don't have anything to say off the cuff, but I can speak that way. Later.